Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to talk about the rise of Jim Crow, so the segregation of the American South. So let's get going. Okay, so post-Civil War era, you can kind of see the settled regions of the United States. So it's about halfway across, just starting to get into Great Plains, West Texas area. And the South is a unique place. It's relatively isolated and insulated from outside ideas and influences. And after the Civil War, with the end of slavery, there's this push to restore what they consider the normal social order of controlling the African American population. So a lot of people are moving westward, like we've talked about before. A lot of people are trying to get on with their life after the American Civil War. The cities are beginning to grow. You have a new age of innovation, as you'll see in other lectures with Tesla and Edison. And you have a lot of new inventions coming out. The railroad, moving pictures, all these kinds of things are starting to come into existence. Electricity alone is revolutionizing life. But what we have to understand is while some things are looking amazing towards the future, there's other aspects of what's coming that people cannot truly imagine. So John Elfreth Watkins wrote in the Ladies' Home Journal an article that kind of looked towards what may happen in the next 100 years. And he predicts some weird things, like the United States would take over both Nicaragua and Mexico. I don't know why, but he said we're going to do it. But he gets a lot right. He says the American will be taller from by 1 to 2 inches. His increase will be due to health, and vast reforms in medicine, sanitation, food, and athletics will live to be 50 rather than 35 at present. And he will reside in the suburbs. But it gets all this right. We live longer. It's almost 80 years now for the average American. And he sees a world that envisions air conditioning and TV and wireless communication. But there's a world that he cannot see, that he simply cannot understand or foretell, and that is a world where black and white people are equal. African Americans are never going to be seen as equal during this time period, primarily due to a policy, an informal policy called Jim Crow. This is going to lead to the segregation of the American South. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a little bit on Jim Crow and his ideas on it, and he encapsulates this idea very well. It would be one of the great challenges of the 20th century facing Americans. He said, if it may be said of the slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, that it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He gave him Jim Crow. And when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow. A psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than the black man. And he ate Jim Crow. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores, on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children too learned to feed upon Jim Crow, their last outpost of psychological oblivion. So this idea of Jim Crow is going to serve as a solve for all kind of negligence that the South will unleash upon its own people, black and white alike. The redeemers that we learned about in that first lecture, in that tail end of Reconstruction that took back the South from the Republicans. These white Democratic redeemers basically don't want to spend money to help their people. So they're going to leave their people poor and destitute, trapped in a cycle of farming cotton with no way out. But what they're going to feed them is racism. And they will feed them this idea of Jim Crow that at least no matter how bad your life is, you're better than a black person. And they're going to use this solve time and time again. And it's going to push for the growth of Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow comes from an idea. I don't think I have it in these slides. But Jim Crow comes from an idea of kind of a vaudeville style thing where you have a performer wearing blackface and he is a caricature of African Americans where he makes them look dumb and stupid. And this is where it gets applied because it's kind of this farce of what's happening, what is reality, despite what the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments have said. Things are not the way they should be. Now, segregation is first going to hit the United States hard in the South through the railroads. Now, as railroads are spreading rapidly across the United States, you have very interesting things happening. A free black man can get on a railroad in the North, ride that same railroad into the South, sit in the same seat, never move, but he crosses one or two borders and now he's in a segregated state. And that state may not tolerate whites and blacks sharing the same car. So you start seeing the beginnings of segregated railroads. You start having segregated everything. Buses, waiting rooms, water fountains, movie theaters, restaurants, anything and everything that deals with public life will be segregated. Louisiana in 1887 was the first to mandate separate cars for white and black passengers. Texas rapidly followed. In 1889, a Texas senator pushed through a law that required all railroad companies to provide separate cars for black and white customers. During the 1890s, similar laws were passed for all public spaces across the American South. Now we see this take a parallel in the voting booths. Voting was the last bastion of defense that African Americans had after the Compromise of 1877 and the withdrawal of Union troops and the withdrawal of the Freedmen's Bureau and any kind of agency or organization that could protect African Americans in the South. Instead, you had the KKK, their remnants, the racism they left, and this new white Democrat Redeemer South that dominated Southern life. And despite having the 15th Amendment and the 14th and the right to vote and being full citizens, these were slowly going to be eroded through a variety of tools that the Supreme Court will deem technically legal during this time period. The first is a poll tax. So this means if you wanted to vote, so say we look at Texas today, if you want to vote, you have to register, a month, 2 months, 3 months ahead of time if you want to vote in that year's election. Well, this is a similar thing, except you had to pay as well. So it might be 50 cents, $1, $2, whatever it was on that given year. You had to pay your poll tax in order to be registered to vote for that year. But what's crazy is, say one year you didn't have the $2 to pay your poll tax. Next year you go, you have your $2 saved up, you pay your poll tax. Well, you're like, that's great, you paid this year's, but you still owe last year's. So that means the poor find it harder and harder to pay their poll tax, and therefore harder and harder to vote. Now, this is the interesting thing about these Southern Democratic Redeemers, is that they're willing to throw some of the poor whites under the bus as well, if it means taking the poor blacks out of the voting equation. Now, they'll find other ways to bring some of those poor whites back in, but for the most part, if you're poor, they're willing to abandon you, period. That goes back to that quote we just read by Martin Luther King Jr. The poor, the hungry are abandoned and neglected, and they're fed this idea of racism. So other methods come up. So gun clubs have gun shows on election day in the polling stations, and they will vigorously show you their guns and show off what they have if they think you might be voting for the wrong person. Now keep in mind, much of the voting at this time was public. So you literally wrote your name down or had filled out your card, and then you walked up and dropped it in a box labeled for the person you wanted to vote for. So everyone could see who you were voting for. They added things like property qualifications where you had to own property before you could vote. This is something that we had done away with dozens of years before that are being reintroduced, to try to eliminate black voting. Now, we think that the secret ballot, or also known as the Australian ballot, came in, that it might be a benefit for African Americans. But the problem was, during this time period, by introducing the secret ballot, you had to walk into this ballot box and be able to secretly fill out your card. That means you had to know how to read and write so you knew who you were selecting. The problem was the vast majority of African Americans in the South were either just learning to read and write or could not read and write. So this was a hindrance all on its own. Then Mississippi is going to come up with one of the best, in their mind, ways to prevent African Americans from voting. This is called the literacy test. So how it basically worked is on election day, you would go to vote and you would have to read an excerpt of something, usually like a piece of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. And if you could read it, then you could vote. Now, if you couldn't read, and they did this for poor whites, you could interpret it. So this is the interpretation clause. So if you couldn't read it, you could have it read to you, and then you had to interpret it. So oftentimes the way it worked out is a poor white would walk up, couldn't read, would have it read to him. So the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, so on and so forth, or a piece of the Constitution, the preamble, whatever it might be. And they would say, oh yeah, America, it's the land of the free, we're all equal, great, hurrah. They'd be like, that's perfect understanding, go vote, sir. Then an African American man would walk up. He would have it read to him. He would offer this insightful, nuanced response about liberty and freedom. They'd be like, no, sir, you do not understand what this means. You cannot vote. Now, are they basing it on race technically? No. They're saying it's on interpretation of what was read. But that is subjective. And the subjective criteria that they're applying is effectively race. So while on paper it may not look like racial discrimination, in effect, in reality, it is. But this is one of the ways, one of the biggest ways that they prevent African Americans from voting while retaining some poor white voting. So you see this start changing over time. But you can see the South is going to be predominantly a one-party region. The Democrats are going to win almost unanimously in the South no matter what. Democrats are going to hold that as a stronghold for the foreseeable future. Now, we're going to talk about several big civil rights cases that are going to kind of define Jim Crow and what it means for the foreseeable future. So, in 1883, you have the case called Civil Rights Cases. So it's kind of a collection of several small cases. And in this case known as Civil Rights Cases, the Supreme Court invalidated a Civil Rights Act of 1875 that had outlawed racial discrimination in hotels, theaters, railroads, and the like. So the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court is going to argue, only prohibited the state from discriminating, not private businesses. This meant if you owned a private business, you could discriminate all you wanted. So not exactly a progressive kind of thought. Then you have the big case of Homer Plessy, known as Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Now this is probably the single most famous case of this time period that's really going to permanently establish separate but equal and segregation and effectively Jim Crow in the South. Now, a guy named Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black. Now, if he was just walking down the street, it would be hard to distinguish him from a white guy. He had very little defining features that would mark him as black. So what they did was had him buy a train ticket in the white section of the car. He gets on the train. Obviously, no one has a problem. He looks white. Then he stands up right as the train's about to leave and announces he is 1/8 black. Everybody loses their mind. Oh my God, it's a black man on our train. They call the cops, have him arrested, have him taken off the train. Now this is what they wanted. This is what Homer Plessy and his lawyers wanted so they could test this segregation issue. It goes through the lower courts, makes its way eventually to the Supreme Court. And they're not going to get the outcome that they were hoping for. So after getting pulled off the train, after all this plays out, the Supreme Court's going to rule that segregating in public and private situations were perfectly equal in keeping with the 14th Amendment, as long as those separate places were equal. So this is where the separate but equal mindset comes from. Now the problem with separate but equal is obvious. If you separate something, it can never be equal. But nonetheless, this is going to be the law of the South for the foreseeable future. And Plessy versus Ferguson is going to be the key linchpin law or decision, legal decision, that abolitionists or now civil rights advocates are going to be fighting against. The final big case we'll talk about is Williams versus Mississippi in 1898. This is a much smaller case, or less well-known case, but equally as important. So when African Americans challenged the legality of all of these ridiculous methods from preventing them from voting at the polls as violations of the 14th and 15th Amendment, the Supreme Court ruled that things like poll taxes and literacy tests were legal as long as they didn't explicitly discriminate based on race. So as long as it doesn't say, oh, black people can't vote, that's fine. If it says poor people can't vote, that's okay. But as long as it doesn't say a race, you're good. If it says black people can't vote, that's a no-no. But if it says poor people can't vote, illiterate people can't vote, people without property can't vote, all of these are okay. Basically, they're saying if you discriminate against the poor, that's okay. But you can't discriminate based on race. The problem with this situation is in the American South, in this post-Civil War era, the next 50 years or so, you have African Americans being trapped in a state, many of them in a state of semi-poverty, if not full poverty, and therefore many of these laws are going to bar them especially. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, having your legal rights stripped from you, there is an informal expectation for African Americans to follow a kind of silent set of laws that aren't written down, but they're applied arbitrarily by the white population in the South. And this line of acceptance, what is acceptable behavior for African Americans, constantly moves. And this is going to lead to a lynching culture across the American South. Now, when we think of lynching, we often think of people being hung. And while yes, that is one type of lynching, lynching is a little bit broader of a term. Usually it involved some sort of perceived vigilante justice where the mob that was enacting this justice thought they were righting some sort of wrong. Often the actual murder is preceded by some sort of torture. And the form of execution could be hanging, but it could be any number of things. It could be shooting, it could be, death by enduring the torture. Any number of things could kill the person and still be considered a lynching. Just hanging was often the quickest and easiest for many of these mobs. Now, between 1890 and 1920, Texas lynched about 309 men. 249 of those were black, so that's roughly 81%. Now, this might not seem like a huge number in sheer terms of size of number, but it's incredibly public in nature. These aren't private things that someone did in the backwoods. People gathered to watch these murders. They showed them to their children. They had picnics to watch this so they could teach their children this is justice being enacted. Lynchings tended to flourish where whites were surrounded by what they called strange Negroes, African American, typically single men that were unknown to their community, with no whites to vouch for them. But that was not always the case. In the case of Henry Smith, in the spring of 1893, a young girl named Myrtle Vance was raped and murdered in the town of Paris, Texas. Henry Smith, a 27-year-old black man who was known to be a drunk and disorderly in Paris, was immediately suspected of the crime and captured. He was then taken to a railway stop in an open field just outside of Paris, where the massive platform was to be used in his public torture and execution. Now, there was no trial. There was no evidence that he committed it. We don't know to this day if he did or did not commit the actual crime. But nonetheless, he endured the horrific execution and torture as a result of this crime. Now, the horrific nature of this execution defies real description. but we will do the best that we can. The posse built a white-hot fire of charcoal beneath the platform as they strapped Smith to a pole at the top. They ripped Smith's shirt and coat from him and then heated up irons in the fire and began to burn his flesh off of him. Myrtle Vance's father, brother, and uncle led the torture. They brought up red-hot irons and began to singe the flesh off his legs, rolling the irons methodically across his feet and legs. They then pushed the irons into his genitals when one newspaper reported, quote, "A prolonged scream of agony rent the air." After methodically burning almost every square inch of flesh off his body, Henry Vance, Myrtle's father, plunged the hot irons into Smith's eyes. Then Vance forced the irons down his throat. After 2 hours of torture, still alive, Smith pleaded for death. That's when the mobs poured coal oil down his throat on the still living Smith and set him on fire. The fire managed to burn through his ropes, and Smith jumped from the platform to escape. Once he hit the ground, however, bystanders forced new ropes around him and hoisted him back over the flames, and Smith burned to death. He burned until there was nothing but bones and ashes, many which were swept up by eager souvenir keepers. The Dallas Morning News called it, quote, "the most horrible death ever influenced or inflicted upon a human being." And what's remarkable about the death of Henry Smith was the public nature of it all. People gathered to watch this. The population that showed up to watch Smith be executed was greater than the town's population. That means people from Paris left their town, notified other people. People traveled from the surrounding communities to Paris to watch this man be executed. No one was worried about being caught, about being prosecuted, about being seen witnessing such a torture. It was instead an occasion for picnics and bringing out the entire family. Children watched these spectacles as parents felt they needed to know about such things as an example of justice being carried out. People sold postcards of events like this. Body parts taken from the charred remains were often put on the mantle and were sold and were displayed proudly. This is the strangeness, craziness, the pervertedness of this time. Now these are rough images, but it's not just African Americans that are suffering lynching in Texas. Mexican Americans are often, particularly in the southern parts of the state, having the same kind of vigilante justice acted upon them. Same kind of mutilations and violence. Numerous stories of vigilante mobs and lawmen alike enacting this on Mexican Americans. So how do minority groups like African Americans endure this? Well, there are several approaches that they tried to endure all across the United States, North and South alike. African American leaders and communities sought different ways to deal with the hardship of lynching and Jim Crow. Leaders like Booker T. Washington came to prominence. Now, he had been born a slave in 1856, had worked hard in emancipation to raise himself up from slavery. In 1881, he helped found the Tuskegee Institute, a vocational school for blacks geared towards practical skills in agriculture and industry. In the midst of this era of disfranchisement, segregation, and lynching, Washington took a unique path. He said African Americans should cease pushing for full equality in America. He said it's not worth the risk. We are dying trying to get this. Instead, he offered what became known as the Atlantic Compromise. He says racial equality is the extremist folly. Instead, we should focus inward, turn towards our own communities, build ourselves up from the inside out until the wealth and benefit of our communities is undeniable. Then they must and they have to give us equality and rights because we will be undeniably valuable to them. Now, a lot of people are angry about this, but a lot of people see sense in it. The risk towards fighting now, in many people's mind, was too great. So turning inwards, building up African American communities, educating themselves, lifting themselves up from within seemed like a viable option. Now other African American leaders, like W.B. Du Bois, now he is going to say, we need to fight for civil rights now. If we don't have them now, what guarantees that they're going to give them to us when we are more viable? Why will they not just take from us then like they take from us now? Now, in 1909, he helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Now, their goal was through legal means to enforce the true intentions of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now, other aspects and ways that African Americans endured. You have Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, this is a very interesting community. It's several blocks of Tulsa, predominantly black, and they are going to have their own kind of society built within the larger city. So Oklahoma begins kind of promoting or being promoted as a safe haven for African Americans that started to migrate west. The Greenwood district, in particular of Tulsa, developed as a black-owned part of town. Now, this included shops, newspapers, doctors, nightclubs, lawyers, dentists. It was a completely self-sufficient black enclave. Money that was made outside of the community, doing various jobs and tasks for the larger city, was then reinvested in the community to make it more profitable, more affluent, and you have this very well-off middle and upper middle class section of town that was almost exclusively black. This prosperity lasted for about 2 decades, until 1921, with the Tulsa Race Massacre. At the height of the 1920s, so 1920, you have the rise of the second KKK. You had a revival of racial tensions across the nation for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about later. But the Greenwood district is effectively burned to the ground. African Americans are killed, they're rounded up, they're imprisoned. It is bad. It is about as bad as you can get. And it's a backlash against seeing poor whites seeing African Americans doing better than them, because that disproves the argument of Jim Crow. Remember, like MLK said, they were fed on this bird, this racist bird that said you were better than African Americans. And if you see a black man, a black family, a black community making money, living a decent life, not hurting anybody, not hurting you, but because they are doing better, that narrative in your head that kept you fed, that kept you warm when you had nothing, was slowly being dismembered. And this is where you get this backlash. Others in the African American community, like Billie Holiday, are going to use music as a way to fight back against this. One particular song of hers stands out, called Strange Fruit. I'll provide a link to her video. And she's singing about the strange fruit hanging from southern trees, talking about the black men having been lynched hanging from these southern trees. So all of this is going to change society, and it's going to push many African Americans out of the South, out of these rural areas, into cities, looking for a new way of life. And this is going to lead us effectively to a new era called the Progressive Era, where many of the problems socially, societally are going to be at least be attempted to be fixed. Racism is going to be one of the most difficult ones to eradicate from our society. It's still something we struggle with on a daily basis in America. Now, we have gotten significantly better, but each generation has a duty, a task to keep pushing us towards, keep swinging that pendulum towards the side of justice. But we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with another lecture next time.